Anything else? No? Oh, so thank you. No? Well, that was fun. I did that for a while. And if it wasn't smoking,
Probably creates more
I think that would
interest
have been
when it's
a
new
little bit. I like it.
again.
On record?
Okay. Tell that gavel. Call to order the City of Lincoln City work session meeting for October 15, 2018 at 5:31 p.m. And we'll start over here with Councilor Hoagland.
Riley Hoagland?
Dick Anderson.
Susan Watkey?
Will you be joining us for the discussion?
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and get your name,
Oh,
please.
I'm Curry Gill.
I'm sorry.
Curry Gill.
Thank you.
Richard Appicello. Ron Chandler.
Allison Robertson. Judy Casper.
Don Williams.
Deanna Hinton?
Kathy Steers, City Recorder.
And just for audience members' sake, this is a work session, and normally we do not have public comment at this time. However, sometimes we do pull people in from the gallery who have specific information that the council might want to hear. So we have discussion items, presentation to State Historic Preservation Office, economic development update on new urban renewal areas, police building update, and a homelessness discussion. So I guess we'll start with the SHPO.
Mayor, can I make an announcement? Sure. The microphones are in the ceiling, and a lot of times people will be reading down. So if you could speak loudly and individually.
Yeah, no
it's
crosstalk,
easier.
like I just did.
Thank you.
Sorry. Okay. Allison, please.
Thanks, Mayor. All right, so I'm happy to say that we have Curry Gill here tonight. Mostly this is because council's had questions over the past year about the city's role and obligations in preserving historic resources. And the topic is in good timing with greater emphasis on economic development and public and private redevelopment interests and offerings that we've been working on. And so Curry is here and has a little presentation, and then she's happy to answer any questions. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you, Mayor and Councilors, for having me here today. I am going to start off with a little pitch to celebrate Oregon's heritage. You can all grab a deck of playing cards if you'd like that have historic places, and they can go out to the audience. So I'm here tonight primarily to talk about our Certified Local Government Program, which is a program to help communities document, preserve, celebrate their historic places. And I will go into some detail about the program and what it offers and what the requirements are. Before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about historic designation, because that is a question that's always in the forefront of people's minds, and I want to get through that discussion before we talk about all the really good detailed stuff that I'm going to talk about. So I just want to start with that and get it out of the way, and we can answer any questions you have. There are two types of historic designation for historic properties. There is National Register of Historic Places, and there is local designation. In Oregon, there is no state designation. We have a list, we have a database full of historic properties, but it doesn't, that's all it is, it's a list. So when someone gets their property on the National Register of Historic Places, that is purely an honorific kind of thing. It only triggers, in the state of Oregon, it only triggers demolition or relocation review. That is all. So there's no other regulation that automatically comes from National Register designation. There's also local designation, and that is where regulation comes into play. So if it's a locally designated property, then depending on the community's code that they've created for their preservation program, there might be regulation that comes into play. There is a state law that if a property is owned by a public entity, they have to go through a review process for any alterations if it's 50 years or older. So that came into play, that can come into play if they're listed on the National Register or not, and has for the Art Center. So looking at the windows of the Art Center, for example, that's because it's a public-owned property. So that has nothing to do with its National Register designation, that's just a state law. So those are kind of the different ways that designation come into play. And we'll talk about designation a little bit in this process, but I just wanted to clarify that for you. Any questions about that? All right, so we'll jump in then to what I'm really here to talk about. So the Certified Local Government Program is a program of the National Park Service. It's a federal program. And all state historic preservation offices are required to have this program. We get federal funding to manage the programs of the National Park Service, like the National Register program, different archaeology programs, survey and documentation. And Certified Local Government is one of those. We are required to give 10% of our grant dollars to communities through this program. In Oregon, we actually really like this program a lot. We really believe that preservation of historic places happens best at the local level. You all know what's important in your community. You know the stories. We don't know those things. And you also know what, how to work with your community to get them engaged and on board with preserving these places way better than we ever could. So we really like the Certified Local Government Program because it helps us help the local communities preserve the places they think are important. And so we have really made a commitment to this. We actually give about 25% of our grant dollars away through this program. So I'm going to start out by telling you all the cool stuff you can do with this program and the support you get, the way the funds can be used. And then we'll end on the requirements because it's more fun to start off with the benefits. So, go ahead. So survey is one of the benefits. I know I've driven around with Allison and I grew up coming here my whole life. My grandparents lived here for a while. My great aunt and uncle lived here for a while too. So I would come stay with them in the summer and shop in the little row of shops across from the art center. And I have seen that you have lots and lots of historic properties in this community. And they're an interesting variety that a lot of other communities don't have. And you have residential and commercial. So survey is a really great way to take a quick look at all of that. Consider if they still look historic from the outside. Consider the year they were built. Look for themes that might be happening because you have all this history of the different cities coming together. They all have different stories, and those will reflect in this survey work. And doing this survey work can tell you what might be eligible for the National Register, stories that you might want to focus on, and themes around districts potentially that might have shared stories and time periods. So it can lead to nominations in the end, but it's really just getting information. The other cool thing it can be used for is planning purposes. So if you are doing development somewhere and you know you have a big row of historic places, that might be something to think about before you delve into the development side of things. Or disaster preparedness, if you are the ones that have done a survey and you've done it yourselves, you can hand that to FEMA when you're working with them, and whatever is historically significant is important to them and can mean additional or special treatment for those properties. And if you have to wait around to do this survey and it's super damaged, then you might be risking some benefits that you could get through FEMA if you're doing that. So it's a really great disaster preparedness tool. It's also the basis for design, like figuring out what your historic properties look like. Go ahead. Thanks. So designation is another one. We can coach you through this process. You can reach out to individual property owners. If you find on this survey you have a couple of amazing properties, you can help them list or talk to them about listing, and they can get some benefits. For example, commercial properties on the National Register are eligible for federal historic income tax credits, which is about 20% of the work that they do. back to them in tax credits over a 5-year period. So, so it can be, you can be providing a benefit to them. Yes?
Can you define what you mean by work that they do? I'm not sure.
It's anything that's actually attached to the building that makes the building usable. It does have parameters in that they have to try to maintain the historic character to get that benefit. But it can be electrical, plumbing, like the guts even. Yeah. And you can also develop your local designation process if you create that. So planning and research, you can use the funds to create a preservation plan. You can create plans for individual historic properties, how to maintain them, how to restore them. If you have any seismic issues or things like that that you want to do a study on, if you want to do a plan for outreach and promoting the historic places, you can do that. So there's a lot of options for planning and research. And that's more of that. So, and then the thing that's kind of my favorite is public education. So back when preservation started in Oregon, places like Jacksonville and Baker City really got on board. Jacksonville became a National Historic Landmark. People think of them as the historic place. And they got the designation, and they put in some rules to help protect those to maintain that look for their community, but then they quit doing the public outreach. And now there's people there that are like, why are we doing this? I don't really see the value in it. And that's just because you have to keep keeping people on board with stuff, which you all know as counselors with anything you're trying to do in a community, you just got to keep people on board all the time. So you can do a lot of public education things like walking tour brochures, go ahead. There's online things, you can do newsletters to people. We had coloring contests and scavenger hunts. And you can do online maps to give people more information. You can partner with a museum that has loads of information about your historic properties to get that stuff digitized and online if that's something that you're interested in. So there are tons of options with this. And preservation awards, which work really well because people are competitive. And then design guidelines and assistance. So a lot of people actually, they buy their property because they like it and they like the look of it and they get that it's historic. Maybe that's even what they like about it, but they don't really know what makes it historic. So when they want to fix something or do an addition or something, they might do it not knowing that they're actually changing that and altering it and making it less aesthetically pleasing, certainly less historic. But you can provide tools for them so that they can look it up and be like, oh, okay, I'm going to add something, or I need to change this, or whatever. Here's how I should do it so that I keep that historic character. So that's what the guidelines are. I know you're working on some guidelines in the community now. And then you can actually provide actual design. So you have quite a few of these properties that the facades were covered in the 50s and 60s. You could take that off and expose the transom windows and bring back some of that historic character. So City of Cottage Grove has a few of these in their downtown. They use their grant funding to do design for about 6 of those. They put it on display in the library, and then they gave the plans to the property owners. Since that time, 2 of the property owners have done the work of the design they gave them. So it's sort of an inspirational thing you can do. And then the last thing is, if you get some people to list their properties on the National Register of Historic Places, you can elect to use your grant funds for pass-through grants. It's a small amount of money, so they're small projects, but Astoria, Albany, Forest Grove, Springfield, Bend, a whole bunch of our CLGs are doing this, $5,000 to $3,000 grants to bring back the historic porch, the tan one on the front, to put in appropriate historic windows, fix awnings. You can go to the next one. I think there's...
Sorry,
Yeah.
you said CLD? Since some of our CLGs.
CLGs, Certified Local Governments. Sorry, I
Okay, thank
forgot to say that acronym at the beginning. And these are some of the downtown ones that were done. This one on the left is one of the Cottage Grove ones that followed the design. And I think there's one more with awnings, and that leads us to the requirements.
Now that one, wasn't that from Animal House? That one?
That town is,
If it's
Right,
Cottage
they changed it,
Yeah.
they changed it, because I remember that. Bummer, now it's different. That was historic.
that is now, you're right. This counts as historic. So, what you get is, from us, is loads and loads of technical assistance. So you have our whole staff at your fingertips when you're a certified local government. We view you as a partner in preservation. You also get access to grant dollars. It's between $12,000 and $15,000 every other year, but it's non-competitive. So what I do for my CLGs is I tell the ones who are eligible that year to apply, hey, it's time to apply. You get $14,000. So pick the projects out of the eligible projects, like the ones that I just showed you, and submit your plan. And if it's eligible for funding, I think it can be done in the timeline, and the budget makes sense, you get the money. What's really cool about that is you can plan. So you get it every other year, and you can plan, maybe you do survey one year and some public education, and then you do some designations one year and then some public education or design guidelines. So you can kind of count on every other year you can go to this pool of money to access it. It does require a match. Usually most communities match it with the staff time it takes to do the rest of the program, which is what I'm going to tell you about now. So the biggest requirement is to establish a historic commission. It has to have at least 3 members, and they have to meet at least 4 times a year. And those would be the people that would care about these historic places, want to promote them, think about what you might use grant money for, and implement the code. So that's the next thing. All of this comes into play with the code. So the next thing is you have to have a local designation process. So you want to set up a local list of designated properties, and you have to create a process, and the commission would be involved in implementing that process. Then in that code, you would also put in where your what kind of regulations you would put into place to help preserve the historic character of those locally designated properties. In this state, you can't automatically designate people, so they have to want their property designated. The commission couldn't say, oh, this is an important historic property, it's designated, and we're going to regulate it.
That must always be the owner.
The owner has to agree. The committee can do the whole process for them and do the research and stuff, but the property owner has to agree.
As opposed to a leaseholder, it has to be the owner.
Has to be the owner. Yeah. Oh, and then you have to review on any National Register nominations that come from the community. So it takes time. You need to establish the code that sets up the commission, the local designation process, and how you're going to treat the locally designated properties. And those meetings have to be public meetings, so there's staff time associated with, minutes and public meeting notice and all that, which you're all super familiar with. And then the grant application, which we keep pretty simple because it's not competitive. You don't have to spend a lot of time justifying why you're doing what you're doing. The funds can also be used to send people to trainings and workshops, and we provide training, so we would provide training to the commission but if it's established, if you go that way.
Quick question, if I might. I'm thinking of Ocean Lake, which is, well, as nicely as I can, is boring, has been boring. I don't think it's ever had a real defining architectural sense there. So when we're looking at something here with a facade or an overhang or an awning, but those never existed, are we tied to what has always been there? Can we say, hey, here's the vision of what we'd like it to be within elements from somewhere else in our city? Did I explain that right?
I think so. So if it's locally designated, you would need to stick your code. Most often, the code would say you need to retain the historic character. So if it never had that, then, but they were locally designated, you would need to stick with that. But you don't have to designate every part of the community. You could highlight certain historic places. That's why survey is really good, because you can figure out what is significant, what are the stories, where are those, and if it's the right place and it's the right story and it's the right moment for that part of the community, then that's when you go through designation and then the regulation applies.
You mentioned staff, needs matching with staff. So if there would be a staff person involved in this project from maybe what department, or would that be just our choice?
Different in every community, so you can set it.
Departments that.
Most of the time it's under planning.
Under plan.
Yeah, because it's design review and it's a similar land use process to other land use processes. So generally falls under planning. And the staff time would be managing the commission and those, and the public meetings and whatnot, and then depends on what you do for the grant, how much time it takes.
Any other questions?
Can you talk a little bit about how historic preservation with the CLG program kind of ties in with the Main Streets
Oh,
stuff?
sure, yeah. So it's a really nice fit with Main Street, actually. We have a good number, I would say at least half of our CLGs are Main Street communities, and they really target their projects, their grant-funded projects toward those downtown areas. So Albany, for example, has always very closely tied their CLG funding, and actually Astoria as well, to that. So they do the design assistance is usually for commercial properties when communities do it, when they have a Main Street program. They help those downtown property owners envision that. The public outreach part, so the walking tour brochures and smartphone information and guides and things like that can be funded through this. So they usually focus on downtowns if they have a Main Street there. And the design review, typically a lot of those Main Street communities do end up doing a historic district, and they want to have those guidelines and design regulations to help keep that character, to show that different authentic place. Because the whole point of Main Street is every town is different, and those buildings help tell that story. So when I'm driving down the coast, I know I'm in Lincoln City and not Newport. So they use it a lot.
So, I don't mean to jump ahead, but there must be a cost to belong to a certified local government program. We pay, okay. None, I like
No.
that price. So once we declare such a thing and start forming, I guess for me, the survey work seems like the most first thing and an important crossroad for me, because I'm curious, certainly just because it's 50 years old, because the town's 50 years old, so we know anything prior to that would be eligible. But I guess architecturally or some kind of significant jumps to another level, I would think. And it'd be nice to see that kind of list. So did I understand you to say that somehow your organization would assist us in a survey, or we do the survey, this commission?
So
does the survey?
generally, we do not do survey, although we might be able to if you become Main Street too, but probably not all the spots, because you have a lot of spots for Main Street potential.
It's a small town.
So generally what happens is the community becomes a certified local government, and their first round of grant money goes towards survey, just as the base. That's how most people start.
So then you're buying a contract, somebody who would
Yeah,
do
you
that.
would just use the grant money and contract with a
And
consultant.
match it, and then, because am I wrong that would be a significant aha moment to see what comes
You are
back
not wrong
at
at
that
all.
point?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then, hypothetically, all that sounds good, and we form, and some things are happening, since you're dealing with individual owners who are, time goes on, how do you bail out of such a thing, of a being registered, or, my property now passes to my children or heirs.
So that's a
Or
conversation to have when somebody is interested in local designation, because you can't be taken off. The property can never be taken off. So what usually happens, and this is the moment where everybody says, why would anybody do that? And usually it's because over time, the community has built up the value of these historic places, and a property owner has done the work to keep it historic, and they don't want anybody to mess it up. And so they choose to have that, and they don't view it as encumbering the property. So right now, there might not be anybody in this community who would do that, but that was the same for Jacksonville and Astoria and Albany, and people have, and LeGrand, and there are lots. So right now it might feel like that would never happen, and even if nobody ever designates here, you can still do the public outreach, you can still tell the stories, you can still provide design assistance, you can still provide guidelines to help them do it, to keep the historic character, and people use those things regardless of being designated,
So, and I may have it wrong, but recently, Salem, there was an issue with the Gospel Mission was buying a piece of property. Come to find out, that property they were buying was a historic thing, and I may be wrong. Not
That might be true, I wasn't following it. But Salem does have a lot of locally designated properties. They
So it
have
couldn't-
about
couldn't be
6
used
districts, I
for
think.
whatever because you're really, it locks you in, is my understanding as to.
Well, it depends on how the code is written,
Whose code?
the local code. So you
Okay.
would create your guidelines. And it might have a lot to do with change of use kinds of things, because that triggers, like, City of Salem has a lot of regulation in addition to historic, so I would say, not knowing that, there are
Anything
probably a
could
lot
go.
of factors going on, so. But it can be limiting for some things, but preservation usually likes to have the building in use. So I've seen, churches become rock climbing facilities inside and still be historic, still maintain the historic character. So there's possibility for sure to allow for some adaptive reuse.
Is redundant. Yeah. Is there any requirement for public viewing or public touring or anything like that?
No, so there is a state special assessment property tax program that exists, and it started back in the 70s. In the first iteration of that, if you wanted to take that property tax benefit, required that you had an open house once a year. A lot of people tie that to National Register designation because you had to be listed to get that benefit, but that was only for that benefit, and it doesn't even exist for that benefit anymore. You can still get the benefit and not have to.
And none of this really addresses usage, it's just the visual, the structural part, right?
Right.
So, yeah. That's all up to the city and their zoning and all that. Okay. So what's the downside?
Well, I pointed out the staff time, right? You're going to create another entity. You're going to have to find volunteers to be on the commission. You're going to have to staff that commission and keep them engaged, apply for the grant and report for the grant.
And for the property owner?
I can't think of anything, because if they don't choose to participate, they don't have to.
Have you ever heard from someone later and said, oh, I wish I hadn't done this?
Usually, that probably has happened, but I hear it would go to the local level because that's where they're doing all that work.
I'm just trying to think how to sell this, and I do like to be able to talk intelligently to people about, hey, there's this side of it that you may not,
Yeah,
you need
so
to weigh that.
if they do go for designation, they're tied to whatever regulations the city has, and it's there forever. So that's the downside, but they don't have to do it. So they could wait a long, long time and see other people go through it and see how it's done.
But, and certainly constantly staying in the time, the history, the architectural.
Right.
So any kind of, forever. So,
Yes, they would
And
have,
that-
that's their,
thinking beyond, you or me that want to do it, and then,
Yeah, you go to sell it.
or, the kids, or anything else down the road. And, you're still hanging those gas lamps instead of electricity.
Right.
well, you can change that. You can change, most local designation does not address interior at all, it's just exterior. So, most people want to keep their exterior really cool and historic, so.
Do most cities, when they do this, try to do hubs, rather than scattered around or identify? Would it make more sense to do a neighborhood thing, to get some density of older buildings and kind of form a.
Most of the time they do create a historic district of some kind. Yeah, most of the time they end up doing that, but there's a lot of work in getting the community on board and education and before you get even close to having that. But yeah, then you can sort of keep the whole feel of the neighborhood by having design review that limits, having 15-story buildings in a neighborhood that is all 1 or 2 story, or, that kind of setback and that kind of design. So that's when that comes into play. But that's, if you started today, at least 8 years out before you get to a district. That's how much work it takes to get the community on board. But Forest Grove is going for their 4th district right now, so it's awesome.
Anything else?
Thank
you. Yes, no?
Good information, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Kurt.
If you have additional questions, pass them to Allison and happy to answer them. So.
Thank you very much.
Sorry it took so long.
No, the computer went totally just. Back. Back. There in a moment. You have an agenda?
Right.
That's okay, I just think, whatever we're gonna go to next year.
That's
Economic development update on new urban renewal areas. That's you?
Allison.
Okay, thanks. So just a real quick update, just to recap, we've been talking about this for a couple of years, and on August 14th, you all conducted a mobile tour and a meeting to discuss possible new urban renewal areas and directed staff to proceed with next steps. And so those next steps include feasibility studies for 2 possible new areas, which are Nelscott Southeast 23rd Street Industrial Mixed Use Area and Rhodes End Villages at Cascade Head area. And we're currently in contracting on that, and the work should be completed within 6 months. And at that time, you should be able to compare one of those areas to the next to see which one, if you decide to form a new urban renewal area, which one makes the most sense to do first, with the idea that if you wanted to do a second one, that would have to wait until the existing district goes away. So that's the first step. And then the second step that we're working on simultaneously is to contact our commercial banking officer. And that's through our financial consultant to check and see if they would be open to us releasing some of the tax exempt property, which does not affect the payment of the bond, so that we can free up some of that acreage that isn't accruing any tax, so that we can use that tax exempt acreage in a new urban renewal area, if that is what is desired to be done. So
All that makes sense. Did she just explain?
Except back up just here, you mentioned when the first urban renewal district runs out, is that, you're talking about the one we're currently in, or the one we potentially may use and then that one runs out? Which one?
The existing one.
Currently now,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, I've been calling it the Highway 101 corridor,
Okay.
because it's pretty much the
That's the one
spine
we're in,
of
and it will
town.
expire in 2 or 3 years.
I think it's 2023, so we have a few years.
Okay.
And we wouldn't be able to use that acreage until that's gone.
Okay, got it. But if it's paid up,
It's paid off
That
early.
stuff.
Yeah, we have until 2024. I don't want to be overly ambitious, but I'd like to think with our redevelopment projects that we will be able to create more tax base and pay them off earlier, but I am not a financial expert. And so, just to let you know, we have heard back from the bank. Our financial consultant doesn't think there are going to be any issues with the bank. They've asked a couple of questions that we're going to respond to, and then as soon as we hear back from them about releasing that tax exempt property, we will let you know.
And we have asked for 125.755 acres to be
125, yes. That's what we are requesting to be removed. And you'll see that, well, maybe, let's see. Didn't put that. So there's actually more tax exempt property in the district. We don't, staff doesn't feel it's good to release all of it for a lot of reasons, but mostly we don't want to exclude, just because someone's tax exempt, we don't want to exclude them having the opportunity to apply for a facade improvement loan or energy efficiency, our loan programs. So we were kind of selective about which properties we would say totally not a problem. And then we also have to remember, we have to keep the district contiguous. So if we dropped out some properties, but it left an island of a property or two that were paying taxes, we had to make sure we kept, a road or some other properties so that they stayed in one big amoeba shape.
It's a shape.
Amoeba. Amoeba. It's an amoeba district. Other questions?
So we shouldn't expect to hear anything more for 6 months? Would that be the plan, or when?
Well, we'll let you know as soon as we hear from the bank. And then if the bank says yes, then we can continue with the feasibility.
But we won't see that for 6 months.
Within 6 months. We're hoping it'll go a little faster, but we don't want to promise. Because they are working on 2 for us.
Thank you. That it?
Yes.
All right. Police, no?
Let's go with Mayor, if we can take just a few minutes break where FFA is calling in, and so we need to get them on board so that they.
Recess for 10 minutes. So the microphone still on, Kathy?
On record.
Thank you. All right, we're back. Everyone good to go? All right, Ron.
Okay, Mr. Mayor and City Council, it's really a pleasure for us to give you an update on the police building. Ian Gerlich from FFA is connected with us remotely, and it will mostly be his show. But I did want to give you just a few things on the update and what we hope to accomplish tonight. First of all, it is really just an update. It's the biggest part is to see, you can see where we are. I want to give you some important dates to remember. And then also one issue that came up in previous discussions was the public park. And we wanted to address that a little bit. As far as the bonding goes, the debt that we intend to incur for this, the next big date on this is October 24th, Wednesday. That's the date in which the competitive sale goes out at 9 a.m. Those usually don't take very long. I did get a municipal market update as of September 24th, and for a AAA municipal market bond 20-year maturity date, it's coming in at about 3.12% as of the 24th of September. Now we are clear till the 15th of October, and so that's changed, and but you can kind of get a general idea of where it is. On November 2nd, Emmerich Construction, our general contractor construction manager, will provide us with a preliminary guaranteed maximum price, and then a final guaranteed maximum price will come to you, we'll receive on November 7th, and that will be presented to you on November 12th for your approval and approval of this project. Pardon me?
I didn't think we had a meeting that night.
It's Veterans Day.
Oh, blast. I got that wrong, sorry. I don't remember the date, thank you.
Watch those outbursts, Ron.
What's that?
Watch those outbursts.
Blast. I knew that. That's about the 15th time that I've tried to put something on the November 12th meeting. We are, okay. Let's leave it at that because that just kind of throws everything into it. And what I'd like to do now is to turn over this part of the meeting to Ian and let him walk you through the building and talk about where they are and the design and everything else. So Ian, you're on.
Hey, Rick. Thank you for letting me crash your meeting today. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. So before we walk through the design as it is, just big picture schedule-wise, we have completed our construction documents. We've given them off to Emmerich to facilitate the bid, as well as put them in for review for the building permit. What you'll see today is kind of where our model left off at the completion of documents. And there's some caveats that kind of need to go with what you're seeing, in that the rendering quality of what you see is pretty good. It almost feels photorealistic, but it's not perfect. And so as you walk through the design, please understand that it's not perfect. There's things about the model that you'll see that may look a little bit off, and you can ask questions about it, absolutely, and I'll point out if there's just a modeling error somewhere in the mix. So take it with a grain of salt. By example, this isn't quite the site that is the building is sitting in. So, all right. So we are. This view is obviously at the upper terrace, right before you walk into the building, and we'll just sort of start walking through it. And so, as Ron mentioned before, there was some conversation about artwork on the exterior of the facade. We had identified these wood panels here that march down the south facade as opportunities for someone to carve them with an artistic pattern. And what we've done relative to that is that we've put those panels into the project and into the design. We've asked the contractor to line item them out separately so that we can evaluate their cost before they go into the project. If they don't go into the project, that's fine. We have a metal panel behind that. So the project functions just fine without them, but that was sort of our opportunity to put art a little bit more forward in the project. And there's such a great history of wood carving in the area that we thought that was a good approach.
Ian?
So turning in,
Ian?
yeah.
Back up just a smidgen, please. This is Deanna. Hi, Ian. Can we look at the panels again?
Can you
Can you
bring it
back
back to
up?
the panels again?
Thank you. Good. Stop.
Okay.
So you were just saying that they could be a line item in the budget. This isn't, I just want to put a placeholder in this. This isn't, I don't think, where council was going. And so, but a line item in the budget, is that within your budget now, or is that separate, additional? I'm confused.
Those are usually, so Ian, let me try to answer. The question is how does what does this mean as far as it's in a line item? The way it's usually been explained to me is it's an alternate to the bid.
Right.
Which means that you've got your budget and this comes as an alternate, if you feel that you want to continue with this, you can, but you don't have to.
Where does the money come from?
You would have to add the funding to it. And so if, for example, it comes in under budget, you've got it. If you're right at budget, then you'd have to come up with additional funds.
Okay, that's one of my questions. The second one is, I'm having a hard time moving from, this should be an artist, from an artist point of view of what would be good, and then have a discussion with Ian, and that's what we set that $10,000 aside for doing the coordination between artwork and the building. And this is prescribed, and this is not at all what I thought we were talking about. Even if it ends up being this, the process wasn't followed that I thought we were doing, so I'm stuck here.
Ian, are we looking south right now?
Which direction are you looking
We're
at?
actually looking east. So right in front of us would be east. This way would be north. And then this would be looking south. Obviously, that's not what's there.
And then also, I don't see any lighting. Are these ballast? Are these ballard? Are those light ballards on the deck there, or is there lighting to this?
Yeah, there will be lighting on the deck. The ballards here provide egress lighting. In addition, this sign that shows Lincoln City Police Department up above, that will have lighting sort of lit behind it so that it's lit at night. And then there is lighting underneath here as well, underneath the sort of overhang here.
So this won't be dark as you come up to it, at night. That's all.
No, it will not. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so the primary entrance to the building is through here to the vestibule. As you come in, there's a display cabinet to the left. And then what's not shown here in the model is we are working through basically a badge, some artwork of the badge from the police department that'll be inset into this wall. And as you turn the corner, then you come into the lobby. And so just in front of you is obviously where reception is. It has two positions for staff. This area, the glass here is very secure. Everything at this point is secure. Basically that line wall there represents the secure line between the public areas of the building and the more secure side. If we turn to the left, then we open into the community meeting room. And you can start to get a sense of the use of the cross-laminated timber in the space, which is, again, it's our structure, it's our envelope, it has displays of function, and it's the expression on the inside. So the overall impression of the space will be one that's very warm and inviting. If we move through, the crash through the door here, apologize. Our meeting space then looks out to the trees beyond, both to the left and forward. Projection wall will be straight in front of you. Can indicate that a little better here. This space here. Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. The projection wall will be here. That'll be the primary focus of the room. That, for the most part, the space will, I think, accommodate a lot of uses and just to have a great presence for the community. As we turn to the right, we have a series of storage rooms here that accommodate tables and chairs and things for the room to be reconfigured, as well as pieces and parts needed for the Emergency Operations Center. And if you go to the end of the room and so turn around, there's space here for just a small kitchenette for people to lay out coffee service and food wherever they co-extend to bring. And you get a good sense of the way that the roof folds across the overall lobby and the connection between the two. We are planning for roller shades across here that you can drop for privacy.
Okay, that was.
So we wanted to have it feel as open as possible.
And Ian? No,
Mhm.
The shade, the windows above, the angled ones, how do you end up shading those? To the north, I think it is.
Right.
Those ones I can see.
The model doesn't represent is that there's trees all the way sort of around the point. And the model can also fake lighting pretty well. So the shade, we have shades across these windows here.
Right.
And because of the shape of the windows, we're not able to provide them here. But this is the north side of the building and it's heavily treed. We don't anticipate much glare coming through that window.
Okay, I'm just trying to think of if you're showing a slide presentation or a video.
Right.
I guess if it's north. Yeah, okay, never mind.
Ian, I have a question. How are you going to contain the acoustics in the building? What kind of flooring? I see the ceiling is wooden. What's that going to resonate? How will that resonate? Will it be noisy?
Yeah, it shouldn't be bad.
Shouldn't be
We have a
bad?
lot of carpet throughout the building,
Okay.
especially here.
That's what I wondered.
And in any place that we have a meeting room or something like that, we have carpet to help us sort of make the absorption
Okay,
needed for controlling sound.
okay.
In addition to that, the one thing that often helps in the meeting room is bodies themselves absorb a lot of noise and reverberation. So we should be okay.
Okay.
As we go outside, as you go outside, right back to the entry, that seems awful spacious. And as you walked in the front door, you had another kind of a capture, like a vestibule. Why so much space here, and how will it be utilized? Who will utilize it?
Not so much space in the lobby.
Yeah, right there. This whole seating area. I'm kind of wondering who sits there and when.
Mm-hmm. So there's two purposes to that amount of space, and I'll speak a little bit for our consulting architect out of Phoenix who helped develop the program and the size of the spaces. But two things. One is when there's more than one people who come to the police station to file a complaint or need to speak with an officer or have something happen to them, we want to give enough space so that if someone is at the reception desk having a conversation with Tammy or someone else from records or having an officer come out, that they're not right on top of someone who's also waiting for another person. So giving as much sort of space in the room for privacy, which is hard to accomplish obviously in the lobby, is important. The second function is that,
Ron, Ian Hamilton, would you guys mind if I brought the chief up?
I was thinking the same
Chief, could
thing.
you join us for a second?
Ian, what is the square footage of that lobby space?
Off the top of my head, it's probably, maybe 250, 300. I'd have to go back and double check.
So we brought Chief Palmer into the discussion here. Chief, the question that Councilor Anderson had was, do we need this much room? I mean, who's going to use it?
Well, as Ian said, we often have multiple people waiting at the front desk for doing their business, and our current situation is they're right on top of each other. And this provides more room. If we have a gathering in the conference room, the EOC or that area, the restrooms are right out here as well. So if you have a large contingency of people and you have a break, this gives them more room to move around in. But I think the primary reason for this space is to be able to give that privacy to the people that come to the front desk every day. So now, whether it's more than we need, I don't know. Ian and his design team have designed this around other police buildings that have been built all over the United States, and this is the standard that they're.
25 years ago, we had a lobby about this size, and it was full a lot.
Yeah.
Is that glass ballistic glass that we're looking at, the lower part?
Are they glass doors? No, they're solid. Just the solid door here is the only one that we have.
But these windows looking into the EOC are not ballistic, correct?
They are not.
Yeah, we got ballistics outside the building on the windows, but not for this room specifically.
Can you explain that first part that you walk in again? Yeah. I just don't, why that? Is that a locked door there in the inside? I mean, why come into a neighborhood?
For the vestibule. One is a code requirement. It's part of the Oregon Energy Code that a primary entrance to a building requires a vestibule. The second is more of a secure function, which is if someone comes in after hours, this outside door would not be locked in that condition, and they can buzz in to a box here to get into the building in case of duress.
And it would serve as a mud room and umbrellas and all that. Yeah. So you don't dirty up your lobby.
This is a side question, but in this whole process, can we get a logo or a slogan for the department? Can we talk about that?
A logo?
A slogan?
Oh, a slogan?
Something? No, we don't.
Well, we bring in the octopus, and we are well armed.
Okay.
I've been waiting to pull that one.
Just read that on like dad jokes.
No, I write my own material.
You shouldn't.
I shouldn't. All
right, moving on, yeah.
All right. So as one other comment just about the space of this lobby, the comment that Chief Palmer was the second point I was going to make, which was just to spill out space from when this building or this room is in use. You need enough space for people to get out and sort of mingle before they head outside. Okay, so behind the secure line, which basically is through this door, we have two doors here. One sort of enters into the main sort of body of the police station. The second one here is the report-taking room. So when someone's come in to file a report with an officer, they can come here. This room it's a small room, but will also be used to dispatch evidence back to people who've had it collected. So it kind of has a multi-purpose use. Like many aspects of the building, we try to use things as double duty as much as possible. So once behind the door, this is where record staff will sit. Basically, we have one sort of clean hallway that goes all the way back and takes you back to the break and to investigations at the back. We have private offices off to the left, which allow shared daylight to come through, but basically where command staff will sit. The door to the left here, that goes into that same report-taking room so that people can access it from both sides, sort of an airlock relative to the security.
Ian, is that the
in the corner
actual,
here,
is that the actual design of the tables out there in the lobby?
No.
Oh, okay, so that's a long way to walk around to get to the middle of the chair.
sorry, is that about furniture?
Yeah, it's all right, don't worry about it. Okay.
All right. So just the big picture point, the furniture is still, as you'll see here, is not what we'll end up with. We still have the furniture process to go through. And I think we identified the date at the 5th, is that right, Chief?
I believe so, yes.
Right, for us to go to our furniture vendors and identify the furnishings. So directly from the records area is a copy workroom and compact file storage here in the hallway that the record staff will manage. And before we go down the hall, we'll go ahead and go through the records area, or the copy room, to dispatch. So dispatch has some pretty distinct needs. They have, they want to be in the north side of the building so they get the best daylight. They don't have direct glare, which impacts their ability to see their screens. In addition to that, the carpet in here has electrostatic properties, static dissipating properties, so that with all the equipment they have in there, if they work up the shop, it doesn't get transferred to the equipment. It just dissipates into the floor. At the end, they have a small kitchenette, mainly because on a shift, if they're the only ones in the building or the only ones on shift, they can't leave their post. They need to be able to get access to a microwave and a small fridge and a few things at the end of the room. In addition to that, they have certain small lockers at the end of the room to keep their gear. In addition to that, we have one private office off to the corner, which gets shared daylight from the main space, and that they can oversee the room. So going down the hallway, then we have the chief's office. Another access to the dispatch area, two bathrooms for staff, the tenant's offices, elevator to the ground floor to the left, and then when we get down here, we come to the break room area. And so this is really designed around how an officer sets their shift. When they come on shift, we have the locker room on the right, and then we have briefing on the left. We have the sort of communal kitchen space in the middle, and then directly behind us is the administrative conference room. And the whole purpose of this is that as we make the building bigger, we want to keep the camaraderie that happens that has been forced to happen in a much smaller facility. And so everyone has a tendency to cross paths around the coffee in any given organization. And so this is really designed to help accommodate that. So if we walk down this way, we've sort of set up control views for officers to eat their lunch and have their break time. And then the locker rooms are here. And you'll notice that it's a little unusual because it's glass going into a locker room, and this has a lot to do with the psychology of open lockering, which we've talked about, I believe, in the past. But basically, this locker area is shared by male and female staff, and that for them they come in, they grab their gear out of their locker, and they take it to a changing room that's on the right-hand side. And the psychology of keeping it open is so that no one feels comfortable actually changing out here. We want them to go into the changing rooms and change there. So then back to the other side is the briefing room. Then back around.
Ian,
and walk through into the locker. Yeah.
would you mind backing up a little bit? I just want to look at, that's where the dip in the roof line is, and I just want to see it again from the interior in the briefing room.
I was looking at.
It's kind of interesting. Huh.
Is that skylight in there? In the briefing room? Is
Oh,
there-
this up here?
Yeah,
So, no, it's not skylights here. We do have skylights in the interior zone, and I apologize, I should have called those out. This is just a gap in the model, unfortunately, but these are steel beams that are intersecting at that point.
Are they lit? Is that lighting there?
No, it's just a gap in the model. I apologize. It's like I said, the model looks perfect in some areas and not so much in others.
So Ian, if there's a leak in the roof, it's going to be right here.
Yeah, right. No leak in the roof.
Okay.
He's promised me that over and over.
Okay, thanks.
So at the end of the locker room, we put a small fitness facility. And the equipment is yet to be determined, but essentially it's another part of the strategy of making sure that people aren't changing in the locker room because it's occupied for other uses. The doors that you see on the right-hand side go into changing rooms where we have both toilet and showers, and help people be comfortable with that idea. Head back out. So here we have a full kitchen, and then the administrative conference room beyond. So before we go downstairs, the last room here is the investigation area. And so this is one of the spaces that had a little bit more room for growth so that we can expand, I think, by one position over time. Private offices to the right, to the left. And then, again, controlled views out. And then there's a block for file cabinets up there. So that's pretty much the upper floor. Were there any other questions before we go downstairs?
I have a question. The exterior windows, is it the type of UV rating where during the day people cannot see in, but people inside can see out? I forget what it's called, but it works very well.
Yeah, the big tinted.
What?
Was it a question about whether they're tinted?
No, they're not, well, it's some type of, not even tinted, it's like people cannot see in the building, but you can still see out with the same clarity. They're slightly tinted, I guess, but it's a type of UV glass that I've experienced in other buildings.
Generally, I don't think we haven't done anything specific to tint the glass or to set it up that way. Generally, during the day, that the interior environment is so much dimmer than the exterior environment that that's usually the case. That's very difficult to see in. But we haven't put any mirrored glass or anything that would reinforce that. Mainly because we're trying to get as much daylight into the building during the day as we can. And so we've organized the building in such a way to keep it relatively narrow and to put people, the working space, close to the windows as we can. Again, to maximize that daylight. But no, we haven't put any special technology in the windows for that.
Okay, that's all.
Like Spanish. It's like the Init Spanish Head. If you're looking at it from the ocean, it's I think it's called solar bronze is the type, and it doesn't really darken it a lot, but it just prevents you from looking in a lot of that privacy.
Excuse me just a minute. I think this is a question for you, Chief, about people being able, people being able to just look in and watch you work. I mean, is that
Well,
acceptable?
you'll have to remember that eventually we will have blinds on all these windows that are adjacent to workspaces as well. So as to whether or not we need that type of finish on the windows, I don't know, I mean, it's obviously a nice to have, so, but I expect that we will have at least shades on all those windows so that we can control the amount of light coming in at certain workspaces and what people can see when they look in. So,
It seems like a moot point. Why have shades if you're gonna have windows that you can see out?
So, well, and I guess I would be curious in the evenings with lighting inside the building.
Then you put the shades down.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah, so, but,
Just a question.
Yeah.
Okay, we're done questioning. Are you?
I'd love to have it if we can afford it.
Yeah.
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
I don't think he heard you.
It'd be good
Okay,
if
are we ready to go downstairs?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
So,
where are the skylights before you go
after we do my
downstairs?
driving,
Ian, where are the skylights before you go?
skylight. Yeah, let me drive back down here. Generally, in the more interior environment, here is where we have the solitudes that we talked about, because it's the deepest part of the building, and it's the hardest to get light penetration to. So everything basically from where I am to the left is pretty well covered by the windows from a daylighting perspective. So we really use the skylight where in the deepest sections of the building where we get the most bang for our buck. And we also have, I believe, some in the changing rooms as well. Again, they're in kind of the interior section. They're behind this wall and back to the back wall.
Ian, I'm going to interrupt a second. I have a question for Ron.
But
What's the estimate on custodial needs for this? I'm assuming
Sorry,
you
what was
need
the
an
question?
extra person.
Well, we have right now a half-time position that does the police building, and then we are anticipating a full-time position.
But only one?
I think so.
That's a lot of square footage.
A lot of vacuuming every night. It's true. No, that's what we're anticipating right now. One. Could be an employee, could be contracted service.
Go ahead, Ian, thank you.
okay. One other thing I forgot to point out actually was this door here goes to another interview room to be used by detectives.
Ian,
And I will try. Yeah.
if you can't go down the stairs, how do you get downstairs?
There's the elevator.
We can get down the stairs. It's just a question of how well my driving skill does.
No,
Is there an
is there an elevator?
Yeah, it was that hallway.
Yes, I'm sorry. I see your question. Yes, there was. Back here.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay.
And you'll notice that it's on the secure side of the building because all the functions downstairs are on the secure side. They're not for the public.
Right.
So when you come downstairs, to your right is the doors that go out to where patrol cars are parked. And they have an area here for storing their gear and stuff when they come in out of the rain. The doors here are automatic, just like you would have in a grocery store, because generally they're carrying a lot of gear with them every time they come in and out of the building. Turn back the other way. To your right is a small conference room for sergeants and patrol, and generally shared by everybody on the floor. This way, the door in the distance goes into the holding area. The door to the left goes into the sally port. And then this door here is the elevator from above. And then this is the patrol lighting area.
Control.
we're taking.
It's the report writing in control room.
Report writing. And then this small room back here is what we call the juvenile lounge. So non-status juveniles are so the held here in this location. It's one of those spaces that can't be locked in any circumstances because they have to be able to get free access out. There is actually a door chime on this door, so that if anyone does try to come out, the officer who's under supervision is right there to assist them. And then in addition, we have a small private office here for the evidence tech. The door beyond is, this door here is for IT, this door here is for mechanical space, and this door here goes to the outside as the second exit. We go back down the other side to the side port. So this is where cars come in particularly when they have suspects, and they're able to bring them into the building in a controlled manner. The doors on the other side of the wall are mostly for different support functions, additional mechanical rooms, weapon storage, things like that. This gated off area, the gate is movable, basically allows us to do evidence processing in a more weather-friendly location that's being done in the parking lot as it is now. And then we have doors in and out of this location, just man doors directly in and out for staff. And then again, this leads us straight into the holding area, so it's a much more kind of direct flow. So in addition to that, then we have spaces for table won't exactly hover the way that it is, but we have spaces here for processing evidence. And then we have one-way lockers that once the evidence is processed, it goes into a locker, and then it can only be accessed by the evidence tag. And then there's hand washing and supplies for bagging and tagging all the evidence information. And that's directly off of the holding facility, which is on the left. For any of you who toured the current police station, that's a big difference over kind of the hallway where the evidence is processed now.
Ian, can I ask you to hold on for a second?
Yeah.
Okay, looking at the lockers, just the locker space, in comparison to what you have now, it doesn't look that much bigger, but by square footage, is it?
Yeah, it's probably, what do you think, Ian, that the temporary lockers there are 3 times what we've got currently?
Yeah, I would say at least. I would imagine that your current lockers are somewhere in kind of that area.
Right.
In addition, the current lockers are not pass-through lockers, which right now, well, I won't go into the specifics of that, but basically this is a significant upgrade. In addition to that,
These roll out.
we have a refrigerated unit so that temperature-sensitive evidence can be held in a conditioned space.
Where would the large items be held? Evidence items?
Larger items?
Parts of cars.
Staircases and things?
So if we have something that will not fit inside these lockers, or we can't move immediately into the main evidence storage on the other side of this wall, we've got that secure space in the sally port that we can use.
But is that 2 garage doors going through, but the cage was just there to show that it could be set up like that?
Right, it's a
Okay.
collapsible cage so that we can engage when we need to, otherwise we have room for up to 4 patrol cars in there.
And then I've got a question about that sally port then, as far as exhaust fumes. How are you taking care of that?
So, Ian, did you hear that question?
Ian, how do you take care of exhaust fumes in the sally port?
The area has 100% exhaust, and generally people aren't running the engine in here. It's not as big a concern as like you would have in a fire station, where often they're doing regen of the diesel engine in an interior space. You don't really have that, but it does have 100% exhaust on the space itself.
Yeah. The way this normally works is they'll pull in, park and stop the engine, and they'll start the engine to exit, but they don't generally pull into the sally port and sit it in idle for any period of time. And then when you look at what we have currently, there's no exhaust at all in there unless the door's open. So,
But where you have it now, do you have offices above it?
yes,
Okay, because I think you're going to have that here too, so that's just
Yes.
my concern is
right.
that odor getting up there.
Yeah, but like Ian says, the way this is designed is 100% exhaust control. I mean, it's the cycling of the air in through here is rapid.
All right, good.
Looks like it's pretty tall, too.
Go ahead, Ian, thank you.
Yeah. And then just, Chief, if you're okay, I'll go ahead and walk into the evidence area.
Sure.
Okay. So this is mostly kind of warehouse type space, but on the right-hand side, you have the rolling high-density storage shelving, which gives a lot of, will cover immediate needs and then gives a lot of space for growth. One of the most challenging space requirements in any police station is just the amount of evidence they get and the unpredictability of the evidence. Some law might change, some rule might change, and all of a sudden they have to hold 3 times more evidence than they thought they did. So try to accommodate as much need as possible, both in the amount of space that we have, as well as the height of this room allows for taller evidence racks to be put in over time as needed, so that there's growth opportunity within that. So this is the other side of the pass-through lockers, so that the evidence tech can grab the evidence that the officer has put in, and then this table that, again, seems to be floating, is where that evidence gets processed and then, organized and then put in bins in the overall storage area.
I think we're getting our shooting range, Dick.
We have an exercise room.
So,
Yes.
This is where they do the officers do their reports?
yes.
Yes.
Not that it looks large, but it sure looks large for the number of officers we're planning for expansion? Or is this more visual than?
There is a 30-year projection for potential expansion of the force. And then you also need to calculate that on a given day shift weekday. Right now, we would currently have up to 20 staff in the building at a time. So the room will get well used. So,
I'll come check.
yeah.
Swipe card. So looking for my range.
You'll notice one thing that's interesting, the wide seats. Whenever our officers come here, they have to sit very awkwardly because of all of their tool belts. And so part of what they've looked at as far as the furniture is to make sure that they can actually fit into the seats.
Ron?
In addition to that, the chairs that we're showing here in the model aren't quite right, because we don't put armrests on chairs in police facilities. They just get destroyed because of all the gear at the belt. So that's part of the conversation that we'll be having when we do furniture tours on the trip.
Where does staff come into the building?
One question?
He wants to know where the interest from secure parking into the building is, Ian.
Sure.
Oh, that, okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
So that's
All right.
this entrance here.
okay. Thanks.
And come in under the canopy and then the back lot.
You said that it's gonna be an automatic door. Is there gonna be something that prevents other non-LCPD members going through that automatic door?
Yes, there is they call it a,
RFID or
basically
something?
a long-range proximity card reader.
Proximity card.
So that if someone's coming through and they have their hand, they can sort of bump up against the card reader and it'll open the door for them.
Slide their foot under the door.
Under the bumper before it's.
Magnetic shoelaces.
There you go. Could be
So that's
commercial, right?
pretty much the tour of the building. Were there other questions?
Is there gonna be any kind of external door surveillance or anything like that?
Yeah, there is camera placement around the building. Those we haven't represented here in this model.
Is it only gonna be on the building, or will there be some facing the building? Like on,
There
around
will
the
be some in the
property?
building as well. So there's function.
You have to tell me later.
Looks pretty good.
Yeah.
Except for the artwork.
Is there a generator?
That's what you're looking at?
Okay, good.
A generator?
Yeah, that's what it looked like, but just wanna make sure.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Ian?
Locally did generate that transformer.
Any other questions for Ian? Okay, thanks, Ian. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Looks good.
All right, thank you.
That leaves us to the issue that we needed to discuss, although this is a work meeting. This is one that next week you can give us some direction on, and that is in the area of the artwork. The 0.5% that is required for all city projects is estimated to be about $60,000. In the budget, you put in $10,000 for someone to coordinate the artwork. We brought this before the Arts Committee, and their recommendation to you is that you do not use the $60,000 that is generated by this project for the police building itself. There's in their motion, they gave a few of the reasons that I had put into your packet. Those include that preferable to have it in a more well-trafficked, visible area where both residents and tourists will be accessing it. It does not fit with the master plan, the Public Arts Master Plan, and let's see. And that the percent of arts fund should not be used under the master plan for architectural features, what they look like. Now, that's a recommendation from the Arts Committee. It's up to you to determine what you want to do with that recommendation. They put a lot of reasoning in it. I think their logic was sound as far as where they were going, and ultimately will be up to you to make a decision. I don't know if we're on the right track with where we're going and putting in an alternate. If the panels, if you're interested in those, then it's in an alternate. We'd still have to hire somebody to do the artwork. If we're really off base, we kind of need to know that. I'm not sure where to go with this.
Well, if I remember right, we were kind of discussing that we wanted the money dedicated to it because, for my part, we talked about Lincoln City's vision of discovering new things and exploring, that this should be part of that. We shouldn't say that's not part of our city. As far as the wood panels go, I don't know why it has to be carved, but things could be placed on them. That's just my point on that. Or even lights.
I guess for me, going back through the master plan, the public art master plan, we asked them to do that, and they did that, and the initial plan was a big sculpture, something to start the process. We've been doing little arts all over the town, and their recommendation was to make a big statement. And I think the argument could be made, well, is the new police station a place to do a big statement, or is there someplace else in town? And I think they, as I read it, they analyzed or at least looked at different places where they could make a big statement. But and it wasn't the police station to be the first. But to me, that doesn't preclude down the road to include, the police, because I think after, as we've talked about, I view that with the fire station, the police station, the post office could easily be a plaza at some point, the outlet mall. And so it perhaps be very deserving to have a big statement there. But I'm inclined, because I don't call it the devotion of dollars generated by the building to go on the building. We talked about it, but that doesn't mean we talked about a lot of things. The 10,000, I agree, was to try to integrate art into the structure, whether it's beams or windows or whatever. But I see their recommendation was from the master plan a big statement. And I'm inclined to let them go with their recommendation.
Does this have to be done adjacent to the building being completed? The artwork? And the artwork?
Concurrent, like with it?
Yeah. Does it have to be done
I
together?
think it depends a little on what the artwork is. As I mentioned, right now, as an alternate in the bid will be the panels. So that is scheduled to be bid on. Other artwork, for example, a statue or something like that, would not necessarily have to be done as a bid right at this moment.
So if we're done in the future, then dollars could be directed toward such a project?
Yeah, one of the things to point out that we discussed with the Arts Committee and weighed heavily on that is that the half of 1% is only from city projects. And a $60,000 generation of funds all at once is very rare. It's rare that we ever do a $10 million or a $12 million project. And so, the influx of that kind of funding won't happen very often. And so it may, if funds from those go somewhere else, it's likely that if you want to have that big of a pot, you'd have to have extra funds other than what is generated from the half of 1%.
So could those funds be put aside somewhere and held until they're needed for the police department?
The $60,000?
Yeah.
Well, yes, ultimately it's a budgeting issue.
But again, the plan, as I recall, the master plan called for a big statement, and here's 60,000 devoted to that. In addition, if I read the plan correct, they're not limited or would be limited to just public building operations generating revenue. Their plan is to go after other art donations and grants.
That's true.
To help carry the ball, get the momentum moving. And I think, Judy, to your statement, certainly it's a budget item, and the will of a budget committee, money can be moved.
I'm not going to lose any sleep if it goes somewhere else. I'm fine. I want public art.
Right.
I want it out there. I'm just going back to the way it was, I don't want to say sold, but as we talked about, what are we going to make this building look like? How big will it be? Who's it going to serve? I just continually remember being redirected to well, we want the public in it, we want the public in it, so we've dedicated more money to a larger meeting space that people are gonna go to. We wanted it more friendly for people to come to, and instead of just the austere, hey, this is the rectangle you're getting. And to me, that's why I would advocate for the art project there. But if that's what we want, if we want to bring people to that building and integrate it as part of our town, not just this place where you go to get in trouble, or out of trouble, that would be part of it, to that softening of that, and inviting our guests to come there, not just
And I don't
people using the building.
I don't disagree with you. I think those were the talks and why you got the design you got instead of just a box.
Which
So-
increased that money, which increased the funding, and, well,
I know, but I think that's if we.
Could we
if
have gotten
could
away with
believe-
10 if we didn't
If we
do
can
that?
believe the rendering.
Right.
I mean, it's a very attractive building with the beams and the
Right.
windows and stuff, so I think we've got it. Now,
but could we have gotten away with 10 million if we didn't do all those changes based on, we want to make this friendly and pretty and. You know what I'm
so you
saying?
moved off the art discussion?
Well, no, but I'm
Oh.
just saying, it's part of the public attraction of the building.
Yeah, the design is, I would agree, I think it's very attractive, and I guess what I'm saying is because it is attractive, I don't think it needs, it's not a place where the public.
It's not tourist attraction.
Bingo, is not going to be immediately enamored with, to my earlier statement, as you make a plaza, with the fire station stuff and do with something in that other wetland in front, it could be a gathering place.
A nice public art to our first responders
Down,
would be a wonderful.
but we're
big
looking
picture.
down the road.
And it's
And
adjacent
in the
to a
meantime,
major park.
we got to get started,
Yeah,
with a piece per their plan, some kind of.
I mean, couldn't it be on the backside where the park comes into play? I mean, that's the other question isn't there supposedly going to be a way to Southeast 3rd Street from the other side of that where there's a park in plan? So, I mean, could we hold off and say, hey, similar to Regatta Park, let's put something in this park police place, that it's a plaza, we have this, fire station police, park, oh, there's art also here.
Yes.
Because that's going to be a public thing too, so.
Driving, we don't have plans to connect that. However, we do have a conceptual park design that has been completed and will be coming to you at your next work meeting for that area between the police station and Southeast Third. So yes, that is also a part of the ultimate development of this 19 acres that we have.
Well, I don't know if you've got any direction or not. I mean, we've got one
Well,
place that said,
I
yes.
guess the biggest question that I have, the one that I think I need the most help in, the decision on the artwork doesn't necessarily have to, the decision on whether or not to do it at the building doesn't necessarily have to be made until you actually get the prices that come in. But right now, the alternate that we're working on, or the bid, are these panels. And I need to know if that's okay, and then we would, if you want to go forward with that, then we'd hire somebody to do the design that goes on those panels. Or if we are missing something entirely, and those panels really aren't the way to go. Because if we need to do a different type of alternate for the bid, then we need to get in that direction. So
In my mind, it's the panels look great, but is that the public art that I had thought that was going to be? A statue or something big? That wasn't in my mind.
For sure, there's $60,000 and some dollars going to come into the pot for the percent for art because of the cost of this project. That'll happen. What Ron's telling you is you're going to need to make a decision whether or not you're going to have, at a minimum, this panel artwork introduced at this time. And if not now, then you can always come back later and decide to use the $60,000 later.
I mean, that wood looks fine just as it is on the side. I mean, I don't know why it has to be.
Probably noticed that I've been quiet, like why? I have this to say. We are talking right now about adding on some piece of art. And it really goes against the initial conversation that we, or at least I had with all of you when we were talking about art. That it would be, as Dick had said, integral to the building. It would be a structural feature. It would be something something artistic or
Standalone.
creative or something that had some piece to do with the personality of the building or whatever. So we blasted through that, and now we're just hanging something up on the wall, which is exactly the opposite approach that we were, at least I was initially talking about, making art part of, because we are doing the community part of it. We do have a community room space, which is really needed, and I'm sure that it's going to be well used if in fact we get the word out. And there's all these opportunities for doing that, but now we're just hanging something on the wall, which is
why the $10,000 was put aside to coordinate that, I thought.
with the art, and art, if this had been done correctly in my mind, the artist would have been brought in early, whoever that is, or if it was the art committee or some other process, to help work with the chief and with the AFF to figure out what that is. And I don't know what it is.
But I think the recommendation from the Arts Committee was that they don't put it in at all, and so we were presented with
We were
this.
talking about this well before
I
we
know.
got
I
the plans, so
know.
I'm just saying.
But they recommended to staff, no, not at the building, and put it somewhere.
Yeah, I guess I would argue, because I'm agreeing with you, because you've heard me say I thought it was going to be incorporated in the building. I think it is incorporated into the building. It's not to the extent you had envisioned, but, the angles of the building. It's not a flat roof. It's not, it's angles. So that by itself is artistic to me. The beams inside, the woodwork, the window shapes, they're not just squares. So not that they couldn't have done more. And I think that's where we all, or you and I at least thought the 10,000 would help bring in, a U of O architect from art school to help blend it in, might have brought it a little different. But, I'm happy that this isn't a square box. It has look there. And I agree. And I think down the road, I could envision more art inside, outside, standalone, all this stuff.
Question about the panels, because I'm not remembering. Did that walkway go in front of those panels? No, so you got
Just
some
don't-
panels that you can't even see.
They were all to the right of
You do
it,
when you drive, your public parking lot is out in front of
How far
those, so
away
you see.
up the second story.
But yeah, how
So they're
far
up
away
here.
from those
So it wouldn't be, you couldn't touch them.
No, that type, because you'd see them.
Well,
But again, in my mind, those are panels that could be there or not there. They could be covered with art or not. And so as far as worrying about a budget of they could be plain panels that could be removed tomorrow or 10 years from now and something, artistic placed there. It's kind of a placeholder.
I do have to agree with you, though, about the building. It is a nice design. They've done a good job with that.
it's artistic.
And we've passed the point at which, my thinking, that bus sailed. Wait, that's not right, but you know what I mean?
That's a tough metaphor.
The flying bus. So.
That police car moves
So is this
on.
holding up the decision to move forward with the police building? Is that what we're?
No. No.
Okay.
But right now, the alternate that is in the bid package are those panels. Now, and it's not specifically what those panels are going to be on. There will still be a design that has to be done for that type of artwork.
Would the panels be there irregardless?
Well, there would be panels there, but they would not be put together by an artist.
But there could.
I mean, we're talking like
Could there be
25 2x12s, it seems like in my mind,
Yeah.
attached to the side of the building.
No, that's the different part of the building.
The front of it. That's what
When you come up, it had several pieces of wood that goes in it. Those are part of the building. Then you had several sections of panel.
Yeah,
Right.
which
They
look
were
like
kind of light
2x12s.
brown.
Yeah.
Flatboard.
Yeah.
And what you saw on the rendering was just exactly what you
That's what I'm
described.
saying.
Flat board.
Right.
However, what's been envisioned is carved.
Right. Like the Welcome to Lincoln City sign in the south end of town. Carved
Or
like
something like Salishan.
Yeah.
Think more of like what you see in Salishan.
So that panel is the wood that one would carve, I mean, it has,
That's the
it's
concept.
the carvable wood, okay?
That's the concept.
As opposed to putting in just the plain wood flat panel.
Well, that's what we were shown, because they're not gonna.
Right, but I mean, you're saying you want to put this carvable wood in, it will cost more versus putting in the plain wood panel.
Well, get a price for that.
Right.
Yes.
But in the meantime, it could be, if we don't have money for it, there could be plain
The panels would match the rest of the building.
of which could be removed in the future to replace with a carpet.
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay.
What upsets me is that we didn't involve the Public Art Committee a long time ago and get their input and decide then what could be done. I would have liked to have known that the percent for art funds could not be used to pay for architectural features, which is kind of what we were talking about. And supposedly that's not the way it happens. I'd be for looking at how much it would cost to carve this. But we can't use the percent for art funds for that. Is that correct?
Well, your master plan, which you have adopted, says that it should not. That's the guidelines that are in the master plan, and that is one of the basis for the recommendation that the Arts Committee had, is that it's specifically identified in the master plan not to use it for architectural features.
But are wood panels that are aesthetically pleasing, that's not an architectural feature, is it? I mean,
Do you mean like you couldn't use the money to have metal bracing in the glue lamps up above that look decorative? We couldn't use it for that?
So look at it this way. I've got $60,000, and I think a really cool fireplace would be great. That may not fit within the master plan because it's a part of the architectural nature of the building itself. And so in our discussion with them, as they looked at it, those panels were part of the building.
Structurally, that doesn't make any sense at all. I don't agree with that at all. Not at all.
The skin on the
It's
outside.
a concrete wall that you're attaching
So-
carvable wood to. That has not, absolutely
So
not
if we put the
architectural.
wall up there and later,
Yeah.
then we can use
Sorry.
public art funds
I-
to put
I
carving
disagree
on
with that
top of it.
completely.
Doesn't make sense.
So does it cost anything to get a alternative bid?
No.
Okay. So, why, if we're so lucky to be under budget, then we can make the decision then. In the meantime, finish the wall, but so that a panel could be removed if and when. Wouldn't that be the sensible thing? And just, we'll see if we have money, in 2 years.
So I'm not going to lose sleep, but I do want our to advocate for the big project to be there. But
And if we'd involved the Public Arts Committee earlier, that might happen.
it's back to- Yeah. Okay.
you know what you need?
I do, and going into the next one, if you give me just a couple more minutes to do slide change over.
10? Take a 5-minute recess.
Real fun. Real fun.
Say we need a $5
Yeah.
fine.
On record.
Thank you. Okay, guys, we could gather again, please. Okay, so we're back. We're going to be discussing the homelessness issue here and sheltering and this and that. We've got a good contingent out here that I think is here to hear that. I just want to remind everyone out in the public, this is a work session. We do not normally take public comment, but as we begin talking, if we feel it relevant to bring a party in, we might do that to get some advice. Or anyway, but I do want to remind you all, please do not, no outbursts, no offering opinions from the audience. We cannot and will not make decisions here today, so nothing is in finding or talking. I do want to remind everyone, if you got a phone and it's on, turn it off, turn it down, take it outside, same with conversations. And I think that's about it. Ron?
Okay, thank you, Mayor, City Council. It's a pleasure to talk about this. This was, City Council had asked us to have a discussion during a work meeting on homelessness. And so the purpose of this part of our meeting is really twofold. First is to discuss homelessness, including the current policy of the City Council that the City Council is pursuing. And second, to discuss the warming shelter organization and the current predicament that it is facing.
Yeah, Ron, I'm sorry, I got to interrupt. Just because I'm going to be walking a fine line on this, I'm going to try to state the topic of what will affect the general population and what's the word I'm looking for? It covers everybody, but as we start talking about the warming shelter itself, I may have to recuse myself from some of this. So
I will let you know when we transition into this. I do ask a couple of, we've got quite a bit of material to cover, and so I do, and we'll be discussing these two topics in three different sections. One is providing background as to where we really have been over the last 2 years as it pertains to homelessness, actions the city staff is currently taking, and then policy questions for the council. So one thing I would ask is questions that you have, write them down, but hang on to them until we get towards the end, because I think we'll be able to answer most of your questions, and what we don't answer are going to be questions we're going to ask of you. Okay? So in 2016, the city began considering homelessness and how the city can best serve the homeless community. We looked at the definitions of homelessness, and you can follow along the slide. Sorry if you to read much of this, but there were really in the Lincoln County, At Home in Lincoln County 2.0 had defines homelessness as people who are living in a place not meant for human habitation, in emergency shelter, in transitional housing, or are exiting an institution where they temporarily resided. People are losing their primary nighttime residence, which may include motel or hotel or a doubled-up situation, within 14 days and lack of resources or support networks to remain in housing. Families with children or unaccompanied youth who are unstably housed and likely to continue in that state, and people who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, have no other residence, and the lack of resources or support networks to obtain other permanent housing. So in the course of our discussion at the end of 2016 and 2017, that was a generally accepted definition that we based the policy that we're currently under upon. We also looked at the contributing factors to homelessness. I won't read through those other than to say there were many, and they are as complex as we are complex, and they are varied as the human race is varied. We also then looked at organizations, private and public organizations that provide services to homelessness. You can see that there are 28 organizations that we had identified at this time. That is not an inclusive, all-encompassing list. Those are just some that are within our city, that are working within our city or within our county that provide services to the homeless. City Council then also reviewed the contributions that it had made between 2007 to 2016. During that time, it had contributed about $525,000, of which $439,525 went to organizations that serve the homeless. They included Adults Supporting Kids, Angels Anonymous, Business for Excellence in Youth, Community Development Corporation of Lincoln County, Community Services Consortium, Faith Community Services, Family Promise, Habitat for Humanity, Helping Hands, Lincoln City Food Pantry, Lincoln City Warming Shelter, Lincoln County Children's Advocacy, Lincoln County Food Share, My Sister's Place, Neighbors for Kids, Northwest Coastal Housing, Senior Mills, Thugs Off Drugs, and Truman Recovery Center. That takes us really in the discussions we had over several meetings with different organizations, public meetings that we had. And all of that, in 2017, the City Council embarked on a policy that we have been following ever since. And that's basically you can say it in two ways. It was that we would continue to support the organizations that provided for the homeless, and we would not try to create any new programs that would be run by the city. And that also included increasing the amount that we budgeted for outside agency requests by $100,000, which was done in the fiscal year 2018 budget and the 2019 budget, the one we've just adopted, and the funds that have been distributed. So as I mentioned, $439,000 between 2017 through 2016. These are the contributions that were made in the last 2 years since you embarked on those policies. In 2018, you can see the list of the organizations that received it. Total was $149,530. And then in 2019, $150,000 has been donated to these organizations for a total of $299,530. Okay, there's some pros and cons to this approach that we have seen over the last couple of years that have developed. The first pros are successful organizations focus their efforts. Okay, the second is the city is not duplicating efforts, and the third is that private organizations are more adaptable than government programs, are more nimble. One of the difficulties with government programs is that we never know how to get off government programs. Even if they're not succeeding, we don't know how to end a government program because they usually end up with a constituency that follows that. The cons that we have seen that are coming out of the policy, there's never enough money. Okay, our council you guys know that as well as anybody, as you've had to go now through several years, and particularly the last 2 years, of receiving funds that far exceed the amount that is available. Okay, this last year, for example, we had $150,000 that we were contributing and over $200,000 in requests. It will always be that case, and no matter how much the city has, there will always be funds that will exceed, requests that will exceed that. One of the other problems that I have noticed is that there ends up with an entitlement feeling with organizations that receive those funds. And then there also becomes a dependence on government, which makes it very difficult as you are divvying up funds when people are depending on money and they don't get as much as they think as they had asked for or think that they should receive that. Now, also in this time period, and particularly in 2018, the city established some of its own priorities. The first is workforce housing. The second is economic development. The third is infrastructure maintenance. And the fourth is police services. Under the workforce housing and the economic development, we identified 8 parcels that the city owns and are negotiating with developer partners right now. 4 of those properties deal with housing. And as the development agreements come back, you will find that there are incentives that are being asked of the city in order to make their developments meet the workforce housing. Okay, economic development, we're seeing the same thing as we're working with developers on parcels that the city owns, existing buildings, vacant properties. Infrastructure maintenance, you're familiar with that, and then of course we just went through an hour-long discussion on the police building. Okay. Now, there's some other things that have come up in this discussion that over the last few weeks, last over a year period, that are significant and important in this discussion that are complicating factors. The first is zoning. Okay. In our, there's two parts that I want to mention this. In our ordinances, as you know, under a land use ordinance, there are things that you can and things that you cannot do within any particular zone. Okay. The best example of the one we have been dealing with is for a shelter. Shelters are permitted in the general commercial and the recreational commercial zones. They're not permitted in other zones. We have used in the past, or we have discussed in the past, accessory use as a way of providing sheltering facilities in different zones. Not all zones allow for accessory uses. Okay? One of the things that I want to mention that is critical as you consider zoning is the importance of process. Okay? Zoning is a hot topic no matter what. I've never been involved with any land use issue that is not hard. Land use is always hard because you're always telling people what they can and cannot do with their property, and you're telling their neighbors what kind of property they're going to have next to them, what's going to happen with the property next to them. And for every person that feels this way on one side, there's somebody who feels just as passionately and just as deeply on the other side, and neither of them are right and neither of them are wrong. It's just their feelings about how the city should develop. My experience over the years is that most people may not like a decision the city council and the planning commission makes as it pertains to land use, but they can live with it if they feel they have been fairly heard and considered. When they don't feel that, then they're just angry. And so process as it pertains to land use, in my opinion, is extremely important and should not be shortcutted or sidestepped. The second that I wanted to bring up a little bit is in the area of accessory use. The city has had a very, very long history of accessory use that, in my opinion, has caused most of the problems. And it has been the liberal interpretation of what accessory use actually means. We saw that with VRDs, as that was one of the main discussions. The main points of the VRD discussion is, what does accessory use actually mean? And it caused a lot of bitterness and it caused a lot of divisiveness as people staked out their position based upon how they wanted to use the property or how they wanted to see their neighbors use the property. We're seeing that same thing develop as it pertains to shelters. And it has brought to surface some things that have been riding under the radar. For example, we have an organization that uses churches to provide sheltering for those that are homeless. That has been under the radar, and it's been, and I contacted this organization, asked where their current churches are, just so I would know, and they're all within areas that permit accessory uses, or they're in the general commercial area. But it's then led to a question of what does it actually mean as far as an accessory use? Is a church that is housing 2 people, is that an accessory use? Is a church that is housing 35 people, is that an accessory use? If there is a big mistake that I think that your staff has made, and I'll accept my responsibility in this, it has been in the liberal interpretation of accessory use. Instead of going through the process to make the determination, we tried to apply that, and we're seeing the same problems now that we were seeing with BRDs. And that is really that our staff has had a liberal interpretation of what that means. Well, other issues that have come up in over the course of the last several months has been, as I mentioned already, process. For every person that feels this way, somebody feels that way. Affordable housing, request on the city to do more on affordable housing, request for the city to do long-term care facilities, to initiate treatment programs, to create transitional housing, and just increased programming that is needed. So that is just a brief and general discussion of where we have been over the last 2 years, what your policy has been, and some of the problems that we're now seeing created. Mayor, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Mormon Shelter Organization itself.
Can I go first and maybe just talk in general about the emergency ordinance and stuff?
No, let me get to that in just a minute. Let me get to that in just a minute. So,
Well, just for clarification, because we're not talking specifically yet on just declare potential conflict, because we discuss these issues because I am a landlord of the warming shelters occupying my building at this point.
okay, thank you. The warming shelter is finding itself in a predicament, and that is a lack of a place to be. The facility that they have used in the last year is in an area that does not permit shelters, nor does it permit accessory uses. Okay? And so they're finding themselves in a position where a place for temporary shelters that would begin within the next couple of weeks and would last through April, and then they're without a place that meets our zoning requirements. I mentioned that this has also brought up the issue of accessory uses, that is an issue. So as we have begun looking at what can we do to help an organization that's finding itself struggling, there's some things that the staff is already putting into place, and then there's a couple of bigger questions for the city council. Under the first one of a temporary shelter for the winter of 2018 and 2019. As I mentioned, the city is currently working with some developers on the development of commercial properties. One of those properties is the old fire station on Southwest 4th Street. It's 1,000 square feet. It's a shell of a building. There's a few things that are lacking in it, such as a bathroom. But we contacted recently the developer to find out what their time frame is on this, and they would not be using that facility or doing any work on that facility until after at least April. So after the winter is done. So that facility is available for the warming shelter to use. That does not require council action on that. Under my authority, I do believe I can work with the warming shelter to make that happen if they're interested in it. I briefly mentioned this to the warming shelter board president about 20 minutes ago, because like I said, we were just getting the information today as we talked with the developer. So that is available to use. Richard has been working with us on an idea under the temporary emergency operations that we're also beginning to put into place, and so we do move through that.
Okay, so the council passed, well, let's go back a couple years. A couple years back, the council passed an ordinance with park regulations, and in the park regulations it says that the parks director can authorize camping in certain designated areas. And then it also was the genesis of this kind of thought that it says also in that ordinance, and we did that in 2014, that the city manager can designate areas that are for camping in the city parks and can do so when there's a declared emergency and charge no fees. So we did that a couple of years back, and we haven't used it. Another thing we did a couple of years back was the camping in your vehicle. There's a state law that said we weren't required to by the state law, but there was state law that said we could establish a program for allowing people to stay in cars, camping cars at the property of a religious institution. And that's a state statute, provides the model. You have to have a bathroom and a place for garbage collection. So we actually adopted an ordinance, I believe it was in 2016, to authorize that. No religious institutions in the city have come to us and requested to allow that on their property. Again, this is, I believe at the time we had a gentleman who was living in his car, and he was very vocal in coming to city council meetings, so we actually addressed part of that need with that ordinance. Then earlier this year, we adopted the emergency operations ordinance, which was basically adopting the emergency operations plan and setting forth some of the how to and when we declare an emergency. And a lot of this is delegated to the city manager. And it actually has a section in it where it talks about what can be in the emergency declaration, including what kind of emergency measures can be taken. And when I look back at that, we hadn't really specifically talked about how the city manager could basically appropriate city property for specific emergency operation uses. So I talked to Ron about it, and I don't write an ordinance unless Ron or the council tells me to write an ordinance. So I wrote ordinance 2018-14, which it's on the minute track for the October 22nd meeting. And in this draft ordinance, which you'll see in a week, it talks about authorizing the emergency order to designate any developed or undeveloped public property for temporary use as an emergency facility, including but not limited to shelter, overnight shelter, bivouac, mess hall, campground, staging area, inoculation center, distribution center, or similar emergency operation uses. It also says that private property could be similarly designated after a request or with permission of the property owner, but the emergency would have a duration equivalent to the either the duration of the emergency in the order or some period of time. With the knowledge of the manager, I also drafted a corollary, which I haven't gone over with Richard yet, but which would amend the land use code to acknowledge that we allow temporary uses, emergency operation uses on property, but because it's temporary, it doesn't do violence to the land use plan. An example would be, we have an emergency, Ron designates the community center, which is, I believe, on park property, to be an overnight shelter. He does that basically regardless of zoning and for a temporary period of time as long as the emergency lasts. Another could be to designate a campground or something like that. Another emergency operation use would be like the distribution of water or supplies in the event of emergency. So we want to be able to give the manager the authority in the event of emergency to say, we're going to use this city property for this purpose. It's got the kind of assembly rating under the building code that would allow people to be in there. We're not going to, put people in a pole barn that's meant for hay, but we'll use the appropriate kind of building. So I've written that ordinance, and I've written the second corollary ordinance that would amend the zoning to acknowledge that we have this temporary emergency type use. They're not perfect, but it's something to further implement the ideas that were in that original 2014 Parks ordinance, where we can take our own land and say, wait a minute, we had an emergency, we can set it up. So those are two things that we've done. There are other things we'll need to do, as Ron mentioned, that if we have people that are not acting consistent with the zoning regulations, we need to look at stopping that or authorizing it. So, and this is with the accessory use is customarily associated with the principal use. But remember, accessory use is incidental and subordinate to the main use, a small amount. So that may need to be corrected in all the zones, and Ron and I will talk to Richard about that. And the other thing was, I guess the city of Medford and at the League of Oregon Cities Conference, at least the attorneys portion of that, they talked about the success of their, I think it's called Hope Village project, which is under ORS 446-265, and that is a transitional housing kind of a project. We haven't, again, the value here is it's not a religious organization's property, as in the car camping. This is a city property, and they do an RFP and they bring in a not-for-profit, and the not-for-profit runs a transitional housing project. They're allowed to build temporary housing, and then the temporary housing is used to transition people from the homeless community basically into a more stable lifestyle. It's not a permanent thing, it's temporary transitional housing. And so that was something that, as it's a state statute, it seems to have a little bit of an overriding controls over some land use regulations aspect to it. So as long as you're using city property or government property like county property, should be able to be utilized, but has the protections of requiring compliance with building codes, so you don't have that life safety issue. So I think that's an avenue that I haven't been directed to do anything with yet, but if you're looking for something to intergovernmental cooperation-wise talk to the county about, I know they're waiving $20,000 at it. Maybe you ought to talk about some kind of a transitional housing project on their property, on your property, where you jointly look at providing housing which is safe under the building code, but kind of, goes past the regular land use controls. That's what I have.
And that really brings me to the last part, and that is regional solutions. I recently met with the county attorney and the city managers in Lincoln County to talk about this. And one of the discussions that we had was the fact that homelessness does not know boundaries. It does not know a city boundaries. And that what happens in Lincoln City will affect Newport, will affect the county, will affect Walport, and so forth. And what happens there affects us. And there was agreement by all of us that we should seek out and bring before our various councils regional solutions, regional ideas on how to deal with homelessness. So these are the 4 actions that the staff is already beginning to take. On the use of the fire building, I will get with the Warming Shelter tomorrow, the Warming Shelter organization, to see if they have interest in that facility. Unlock it, let them walk through it, and see if that is something that will work. Under the temporary emergency items that Richard discussed, those are planned to be on your agenda next Monday for further discussion of possible actions. Under accessory use, under Richard's authority, we will be taking that to the Planning Commission to begin discussion on that, to help us go forward with that. And then the regional solutions will develop as we have opportunities for more discussions. Now that really leaves us with 2 very, very big questions for the City Council that we wanted to open for a discussion with you. Again, it's a board meeting, so you can't take action, but Monday you could give us some direction in our regular meeting. The first question is, do you want to expand the zones that permit shelters? Okay. As I mentioned, there's no zone that outright permits shelters. There are conditional uses in 2 zones, 3 zones.
Planned industrial.
Oh, thank you. The planned industrial zone, the general commercial and the recreational commercial, which is essentially which is the planned industrial color? Richard?
Purple.
The purple and the red is essentially what you see are the areas in town that, that allow a zone, that allow a shelter under a conditional use. So that's the first question. The second question that we wanted to throw out to you is, do you want to pursue building or buying a shelter? So, I have done just some very, very preliminary looks at what kind of a cost. When you add land, when you add the cost of building and everything else, you'll be looking at $250,000 for the construction of the facility that could be used as the shelter.
At what square footage?
About 1,500 square feet.
How much unused square footage is upstairs?
Is upstairs. We looked at that.
That's storage?
We looked at that idea, and there is about, so we took the fourth floor, we looked at what could be done up on the fourth floor, and how could we secure it from the rest of the building. And it's about 60 feet by 45 feet that we felt that you could easily turn into a place where people could stay. That would require some electrical work. We'd have to expand the lighting that's up there. There's really just 2 lights that are in that area. And we'd also have to move a door back so it allows access to it.
An interior door.
An interior door, yes, sir. The one concern that we have not discussed is with our other tenants upstairs, and that is the school and how it would affect career tenants.
Falling in line with the same structure as, they're not allowed to leave, or if they leave, they don't get to come back, and, they have to check out at a certain time. I don't recall exactly, and so I don't know what you have to leave the building by this time, maybe and school starts at this time. There could be a transition. Yeah, okay, before you could leave at 8. Well, now you have to leave at 7 or something.
In my discussions with the warming shelter, it's 6 to 8. 6 in the evening, they can enter. 8 in the morning, they have to leave. And so I don't know how that works. I have not talked with the career
But
tenant.
we're talking 2,700 square feet as well, right? 60 by 45, you said?
Yeah, that's about right.
So, that's significant size.
It is a significant size, and that is one area.
Completely.
And I have to say, that's not all of the storage area we'd have.
Right.
We'd move some out, but that's some that was easily adaptable to, with a minimal amount of construction.
Right.
And it'd be-
I've been saying it for years.
I agree. On the lines of this, Ron, the pursue a building or buying a shelter, and I'll just get a head nod from Patrick. You have a building.
We have
You need land.
a donor who's pledged a steel building to us. They still own it. They're pledged to donate it to us if we can use it. It's a steel warehouse. Our understanding is that to put it up within the city limits.
I'm not going to be able to hear.
Oh, shall I?
Patrick, if you want to come up here, please just give your name for the
Just need to sit closer.
Just give your name for the microphone.
Right. Oh, I see. Thanks. I'm Patrick Alexander, the Warming Shelter Board President. As Mayor Williams was saying, we have had a donor who has pledged a building to us. So that donor still owns the building, but he's pledged to donate it if we can use it. At the moment, we've been told that in order to put that building up inside the city limits, it would require basically a skin of some kind on the outside, because design standards would generally prohibit a building being predominantly steel on its exterior. So with a building like that, we basically need to put a skin on the inside in order to insulate it anyway, and then we'd need to do significant work to the outside so that it didn't look like just a warehouse building. That would get us on the wrong side of design standards. We'd also need to cut several new openings in it. At the moment, it has one door up front. And basically, the amount of work that would take might make it cheaper just not to use that building as a starting point, and just to use 2x4s.
Okay, well, because what I was pursuing was, if the city is restrictive on that, and the county be less restrictive, do we do a partnership with the county to say, is there some land?
That is a possibility that I have discussed with the county attorney and actually the other city managers. As we look at a more regional approach.
Right.
And then it's, yeah, so that is something that could be pursued.
It could be a little more satisfactory to neighborhoods.
And interestingly enough, the one qualifier that the city attorney said has to fit in the zoning, and if it doesn't, go through the process. I'm sorry, the county attorney, thank you. It has to fit the zoning, and if it doesn't, go through the process.
And then the next thing I want to kind of chat about is, we've talked about homelessness and the transitional housing and all that, and that is wonderful. But I think what the core discussion with the warming shelter was emergency. We don't know when it's going to be needed. It's all of a sudden we got the weather report, it's going to be 30 degrees, driving rain. We need a place to put people. And these are not necessarily people who are out looking for homes. These people who probably, drugs, alcohol, issues like that, who just need to be safe for the night and want to get the heck out of society after that. And I think it's a different discussion almost than we're talking about transitioning people back in.
You're always going to have people that do not want to live in society.
Absolutely.
Period. I mean,
Absolutely.
period. You're not going to. They're not going to be interested in transitional housing.
Exactly.
That doesn't mean that we shouldn't provide transitional housing.
Oh,
I mean,
no.
So, I mean, having the facility to house them, absolutely, and also transitional housing, and also workforce housing, and also low-income housing. I mean, it's not, we can only do this, we can only do that. I mean, so,
No, I didn't
yes
imply that at all.
to everything.
Yeah, I just wanted people to be focused on it. It is a different animal,
Of course.
And that description doesn't describe all of Lincoln City's
It does not.
homeless.
No.
Does it describe the warming shelters clientele?
The description of people who don't want to be part of society, some of them certainly,
But not all of them.
certainly not all of them, no.
Yeah.
No. I mean, we run a resource referral program which gets people either into housing or into accommodation. And those are people who are ready to change, so it's self-selecting.
Right, but that's within the resource center.
That's right.
What I'm talking about is that cold, rainy winter night, and it's just getting someone safe
Right,
for the night.
if I could interrupt you, Ron, isn't that the idea of potentially using the existing building that's the cities that won't transition to the new owner until April?
It is. It's the warming shelter.
Absolutely.
If the warming shelter is interested, then I would work with them and make it available.
Would there be rent involved?
I haven't talked about that with you, but my first idea is no.
What was the question?
Was there rent involved?
It's not something we're receiving rent on now, so
Okay.
it's not something that I was thinking of as a
I mean,
rental property.
and we need to act now.
Yeah.
I mean, now, and have it be ready, because it's going to take some time to retrofit,
And that's why
whatever it
I
is.
appreciate the emergency.
Yeah.
City manager
And how
too.
about porta potty?
Next.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's, right, toilet facilities, of course, but.
I have been in that building. I'm concerned because there's no insulation. And if we're providing shelter on stormy nights, it could still be freezing.
Well, I mean, heaters, of course.
Okay.
I have one, I'll donate for you.
Ron, you missed the question.
I'm sorry. We were talking process.
I've been in that building. I don't think there's any insulation. And if we're talking about providing shelter on a stormy night, it could still be freezing inside that building.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I have to go through it with them so that they can see if it will fit their needs. It's a building we own.
Right.
It's 1,000 square feet. It's available. They'll have to look at it and decide if it's something they can use.
Yeah. I have a question about when the city attorney was talking about duration of an emergency, if we declare an emergency, can the duration of the emergency be infinite weather? Can it be that
Well,
big?
under the emergency operations ordinance, they're, you know, the mayor's talking about storm is predicted, you know, it's gonna start hailing sideways, the temperature's gonna drop. That's the kind of thing that you have an emergency operations ordinance and a delegation to the city manager to address the emergency. So you don't have to quick have an emergency meeting and decide this is an emergency. And so he can use his emergency operations authority to declare an emergency. We're gonna open up the multi-use room in the community center for shelter for, you know, the duration of this storm. And he can use that authority because we have an ordinance that says that, and we have a tie into the zoning code saying, hey, temporary emergency uses are not going to violate the whole comprehensive plan and the whole system of planning we have here. So that's authorized. It's all tied together. And so there's a couple required elements of a declaration of emergency. What is the emergency? What do you expect the duration of the emergency to be? And then there's elements like what actions will be taken by the government. Some things are like, we will prohibit the sale of gasoline, we'll prohibit the sale of alcohol. Maybe not the best idea, but there's a whole list of possible actions. One of those is proposed to be added to specifically authorize the manager to designate a piece of property for emergency operations uses. It could be a distribution center for water, it could be an emergency shelter, it could be a warming shelter. It's just based on whatever the emergency is. When I was in St. Helens, we had an ice storm. So I put the chains on the truck, I drove to the fire station where the mayor was, and he signed the emergency declaration. And as a city, not as a city manager, form of government there, so had to go get him to sign it. And you know, for the duration of the emergency, you know, he took certain actions. And we, because we followed that process, we were able to get all our overtime for the public works crews to salt and the roads or whatever, got that money back from the feds for the declared emergency.
So there's two questions. Who would okay, so the locations throughout town. So first, aside from this homelessness, if we have natural disasters, this that you're drafting would allow us to use those properties as such, right? I mean, outside of homelessness and warming shelter and things like that, what you're talking about is, you know, distribution, inoculation, and things like that. So throughout the city, depending on where it would be, having a natural disaster would be really smart to be able to say, hey, here are these places. But then who manages that? Will that, you know,
It's usually going to be managed through your emergency operations plan.
through Mark and
FEMA would be a part of that, depending on the.
because
type
once you
of
declare an emergency, another set of standards comes into play.
But understanding that what buildings are rated for too is important. So, you know, tying in the building official and saying, okay, people are allowed to be here because this kind of occupancy expects the number of people you're talking about, or you're going to have people overnight, so you need this kind of a building.
So with that ordinance, and let's say it passes, then we would assess the city-owned properties and say these buildings would or wouldn't be available for this emergency, and then how many people per building?
We already have that to a degree, but I don't think we have a
I
comprehensive
think
list.
natural disaster looking forward would be pretty okay, you
I
know.
think we need to, it's part of emergency planning.
Yeah.
To think about what you have and what it can accommodate, and if it's a big emergency, sure. Well,
Right.
if it's a small emergency, then we can address that.
But there's another component. In the tsunami, city, state, county, federal takes over. They provide the money, they provide the resources, supposedly.
Later.
Yeah, granted. But in this situation, we're talking about volunteers doing it. And I remember Jay talking specifically about the trouble getting volunteers to set up and tear down in a building that's being used for something else, and that difficulty. We need to keep an eye to that,
Sure.
if we're going to say, okay, you get the fire building, whatever we call that place, is there going to be someone who's going to go in there every night, set it up, tear it down, and then at the end of it, tear it down where we're going to store that stuff, as opposed to, do you have a place now where it's there? and not gonna put more wear and tear on volunteers.
Let me, I'm sorry, go ahead, Councilman.
I believe that old fire station building, they could just stay set up.
Until April.
Yeah.
I'm not arguing, I'm just asking,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
something to think about logistically.
So let me just bring in a couple of other things that, as you consider this, first of all, should the city pursue building or buying a shelter? Best time to discuss that, if we're able. That is not a short-term thing. That's not something that's going to put the warming shelter in by the end of this month, okay? So it does not have the immediacy. It would be wise to consider that as part of the budget discussion, because you always have competing funds. And you really need to weigh that against what other $250,000 project there is that's out there.
I would like to, if you could propose what $250,000 would get us upstairs. You know what I mean? Those two things or that.
When we get to the point of talking about that, if we do decide that that's the direction we want to go, I'd be interested in all the other expenses associated with it.
Well, and then also, I can ask Patrick, on average, what's your occupancy for the shelter?
Our average, oh gosh, average I would say is probably mid-20s. The highest we've ever had, I think, was either 37 or just over 40. And, some nights it's not high at all. Some nights we have sort of 6 or 7 people.
So,
Yeah.
So
It looks like the fire building would be large enough to deal with.
Yeah.
But,
I have another question too, just trying to sort all this out. So when I visited, it was a year ago, and there was a space dedicated to women, fewer than the men. But then for families, do you have families or do they?
We really don't. No,
You
I
don't,
think
so
we've
it's
had-
mostly single
Yeah,
individuals.
mostly adults. Yeah.
That makes it easier then for that space.
The other question that we were asking is, do you want to expand the zones that permit the shelters? As a staff, we are going to be proceeding with accessory use. Richard can make that recommendation to the Planning Commission to consider this. That, I think, is important to begin dealing with. And as I mentioned earlier, accessory use is just, without a greater definition, it's causing problems again. But whether or not we expand the other zone, that isn't necessarily a decision you have to make right now either. To me, the more immediate thing is to deal with accessory use. Whether or not you want to expand the zones for other shelters, a good course of action may be to send that to the Planning Commission to begin studying that idea.
So I have a question, thank you. I have a question about that then. Are you wrapping accessory use into this question, or is that separate?
No, we're going to be proceeding
Okay.
with talking about accessory.
I think the question there would be more like, okay, so it's conditional in these 3 zones. Should it be permitted in one of those zones, so you don't have to go through the process with the Planning Commission? Or should it be a conditional use in other zones that we haven't listed? That's more the open zoning question.
And that's more for the planning commission to sort out. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I understood that the accessory use wasn't separate.
Currently, there's no zone where it's permitted. It's a conditional permit.
Yes, and the 3 zones are all conditional.
Not outright permitted.
Okay.
Permitted with the conditional use in 3 zones.
So, I have to admit, I feel a lot better today than I did on Friday. It's in that I hope that we have some options that are available, and I will get with Mr. Alexander tomorrow if he's available to talk about those options, to see what we can do for the immediate time being. And then these bigger and larger questions are ones that we can get direction from.
And I didn't want to make it think that emergency operations is somehow a big solution, but it is kind of, it's legal authority. And it's kind of what Portland did when they declared their housing emergency. They did that under their emergency operations ordinance. And then they proceeded to try to deal with the loss of rentals and all through their land use process down the road. So I think it's there as legal authority for us to get through this. But ultimately, we have to tweak our zoning codes and adopt some other regulations to deal with it. And the idea of intergovernmental cooperation and the transitional housing model that has worked in Medford and Eugene, aside, knowing that's only part of the need, it is there.
Well, I just want to commend the staff for all the work they've done on this. It's helpful, and we look forward to Monday's meeting. Moving forward with this, I appreciate everyone here's their sensitivity to the need out in the community. It's not, it hasn't been rejected by anybody. We need to help these people as much as we can.
I have another little question. Are churches outright uses in all residential zones?
So they're conditional.
Condition.
As schools are, I think. Aren't schools a conditional use in residential?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what I have.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Questions? Anything for the good of the group?
No, I'd just like to say thank you again, and you did, and the staff, it's so well done.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Nothing else? We are adjourned.
Great.
Go home easy.
That's a quick check.